In a quiet Michigan town, a brutal secret was hidden behind the walls of a rundown trailer. A child, a 4-year-old girl, lived in a house that was supposed to be her safe place, but inside, behind that flimsy door, was anything but safety. On New Year's Day 2018, first responders stepped into a scene they would never forget. A tiny body, lying motionless. Her skin, burned beyond recognition. Her small frame covered in wounds, old ones, fresh ones, wounds that told a story no child should ever have to tell. Investigators, men and women who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, stood silent, shaken by what they saw. One detective would later say, "This was the worst case of child abuse I have ever seen." But it wasn't just what they saw that haunted them, it was what they found in that bathroom drain. A discovery so horrific that it left them questioning how anyone could be capable of such cruelty. The person responsible? Her own mother. The one person who should have protected her. And her mother's boyfriend, the man who should have never been in that house. Together, they made sure this child would never see another birthday, never wake up to another morning, never escape the nightmare she had been living every single day. But how did it come to this? How did a little girl with a bright smile and innocent eyes end up suffering in ways too disturbing to comprehend? And perhaps the most terrifying question of all, how many people knew, and said nothing? Stay with us. Because once you hear the full story of Gabby Barrett, you will never forget it. Before we go deeper into the story, we welcome you to our channel, True Crime Zone HQ. Thank you to all our viewers and a special shout out to our subscribers for your continued support. Together, we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Gabrielle Barrett, Gabby, as those who loved her called her, was just 4 years old. A child still learning about the world, still figuring out the difference between dreams and reality. At that age, life should be simple. Days filled with laughter, bedtime stories, and the warm embrace of a parent who would do anything to keep her safe. She had soft curls that framed her face, big bright eyes that once held curiosity and wonder. She was small, but she was full of life, at least, she should have been. Gabby was the kind of child who found joy in the smallest things, the kind of child who should have been playing outside, not trapped in a place where her cries would be ignored. But the reality of Gabby's life was far from the one she deserved. Behind closed doors, her world was nothing but pain. She lived in a mobile home in Sumter Township, Michigan. The kind of place that stood on the outskirts of attention, unnoticed by neighbors, untouched by intervention. Inside that trailer, there were no signs of a happy childhood. No colorful drawings pinned to the refrigerator, no stuffed animals waiting for her at bedtime, no sense of safety. Instead, there was silence. Cold. Fear. Her mother, Candace Diaz, was just 24 years old. A woman with a history of mental health struggles, who had spent her life caught between chaos and neglect, passing that same cycle down to her own daughter. She wasn't the kind of mother who would rock Gabby to sleep after a bad dream or kiss a scraped knee to make it better. If anything, Gabby's worst nightmares began and ended with her mother's presence. Then there was Brad Fields, a man with a violent past, an extensive criminal record, and a documented history of mental illness. His rap sheet spoke volumes about the kind of person he was, about the kind of danger he posed. He had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, social anxiety, and PTSD. He had a temper, one that escalated quickly and violently. Those who encountered him knew to stay away, knew that his presence meant trouble. But despite everything, despite his record, despite his uncontrolled rage, he was welcomed into the home of a woman who had a small, helpless child. And together, they created an environment where cruelty was a way of life. Candace Diaz and Brad Fields were not just an ordinary couple. Their pasts were littered with warning signs, with red flags that, if heeded, could have prevented what was to come. But no one paid attention, not when it mattered most. The mobile home in Sumter Township was a prison for a child who never had a way out. It was more than just a place to live, it was a place where suffering went unnoticed, where a child's pain was ignored. The home itself told a story of neglect, of decay, of a place where no child should have been forced to live. Inside, the stench of rotting food filled the air. The sink was piled high with weeks-old dirty dishes, the floors littered with trash, filth, and animal waste. Cockroaches crawled along the counters, their presence ignored, just like the warning signs of what was happening behind closed doors. Gabby's world was confined to that trailer, a space that was cold, lifeless, and suffocating. She had no soft bed to sleep in. Instead, she was forced to sleep on a plastic garbage bag, a thin barrier between her small body and the freezing floor beneath her. There were no blankets to keep her warm, no stuffed animals to comfort her, no bedtime stories to lull her to sleep. Only the cold, only the darkness, only the silence of a child who had learned that crying would not bring help, only more pain. The walls of that trailer held secrets in the form of bruises, in the form of burns, in the form of a little girl slowly fading away while the rest of the world remained unaware. Candace and Brad had convinced themselves that what they were doing was discipline, that their methods were justified. But in reality, what happened inside that home was torture. Gabby's life was not her own, it was controlled by two people who saw her as an inconvenience, a burden, something to be dealt with rather than loved. And so, day after day, night after night, she endured the unimaginable. And no one stopped them. No one saved her. But the worst was still to come. Gabby Barrett was just 4 years old. A child still learning, still growing, still discovering how to navigate the world around her. At that age, mistakes are inevitable, small accidents that any loving parent would understand, correct with patience, and guide with kindness. But in the home where Gabby lived, mistakes weren't met with gentle teaching. They weren't met with patience. They were met with pain. One of the things that enraged Candace Diaz and Brad Fields the most was something entirely normal for a child her age: bedwetting. Gabby's small body was still developing, still adjusting, still learning the simple routines that children struggle with in their earliest years. But to Candace and Brad, it was an unforgivable offense, something that had to be punished. And the punishments weren't just cruel. They were unthinkable. Each time Gabby wet the bed, she suffered consequences that no child should ever endure. She wasn't given reassurance. She wasn't comforted. She wasn't taught with kindness. Instead, she was dragged to the bathroom, her small frame trembling as she already knew what was coming next. The punishment was always the same. Boiling water. Scalding heat. A punishment designed to break her. The bathtub in that house wasn't a place of warmth, where a child could play with bubbles, where a mother would gently wash away the day's adventures. In that home, the bathtub was a place of fear, a place of agony, a place where Gabby learned that every mistake would be met with pain. Each time she made what should have been an innocent childhood misstep, the water would run, hot, too hot. Steam would fill the room, and the walls would close in as she was placed into the scorching water, her fragile skin meeting temperatures that no one should ever experience. The burns covered her legs, her arms, her back. The pain was beyond anything a child should have to endure. And yet, it wasn't just the burns. Because Brad Fields wasn't satisfied with just punishment. He wanted control. He wanted obedience. And when Gabby cried out, when she flinched, when she tried to escape the agony of the scalding water, it only made things worse. Because in that house, tears were a weakness, and weakness was met with more pain. For months, Gabby suffered. Her skin, already fragile, was burned time and time again. The wounds barely had time to heal before new ones replaced them. The scarring was layered, each burn telling a story of a time she was deemed a failure in the eyes of the people who should have loved her the most. And in the final days before her death, her small body was covered in these wounds, fresh ones, old ones, and injuries that no one outside that home had been allowed to see. Then came New Year's Eve, the night when it all came to an end. The details of what happened in those final hours are chilling. Gabby, once again, had wet herself. A mistake that would cost her everything. Candace and Brad didn't just punish her this time, they made sure this would be the last time it ever happened. She was forced into the tub, the scalding water turned to its highest setting. She had no choice but to endure it. The burns ran deeper than ever before, searing through layers of her already scarred skin. She was weak. Her body was breaking. And yet, it wasn't over. At some point, she lost consciousness. The pain had been too much, the damage too severe. Her small heart, already burdened with so much suffering, was giving up. She was barely breathing, her little body no longer responding. And yet, they didn't call for help. They didn't rush to save her. Instead, they waited. They waited for more than 30 minutes before doing anything at all. And even then, when they finally did pick up the phone and dial 911, it wasn't panic in their voices. It wasn't sorrow. It wasn't the voice of parents desperate to save their child. It was something else entirely. When first responders arrived at the home in the early hours of New Year's Day, the scene inside was something they would never forget. The moment they stepped inside, they were hit with the suffocating stench of filth, rotting food, unwashed dishes, animal waste, decay everywhere. But all of that became insignificant when they reached the bathroom. Gabby lay motionless. She was cold to the touch, her body already beginning to stiffen. Her small hands, once so full of life, were rigid, unresponsive. But it wasn't just the lifelessness of her body that shook the first responders to their core, it was what had been done to her. She was covered in bruises, some fresh, others in different stages of healing. She had cuts that had never been treated, marks that told a story of repeated abuse, day after day, night after night. But the worst were the burns. Deep. Extensive. Too severe for a child to survive. And then there was something else. Something that sent a wave of nausea through the paramedics as they took in the horror before them. In the bathtub drain, something had been left behind. At first it was unrecognizable, just a small fragment in the metal grate. But when the reality set in, when the investigators realized what they were looking at, it was almost too much to comprehend. It was skin. Gabby's burns had been so severe that her flesh had melted off into the drain, evidence of just how unbearable the pain must have been. And then, as if that discovery wasn't enough, another horrifying detail emerged. Her large toe was missing. The burns had been so extensive, so catastrophic, that part of her toe had detached from her body. One detective, a man who had been on the force for decades, a man who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, would later say that this was the most horrific case of child abuse he had ever seen. Gabby was beyond saving, but this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of negligence. It wasn't a mistake. This was torture. And the people responsible, the very people who were supposed to protect her, stood there, without remorse, as if the child lying on that floor had never mattered at all. Before the truth could be fully revealed, before justice could be served, the monsters responsible for this horror would try to disappear. But no one runs forever. And when the law finally caught up to Candace Diaz and Brad Fields, there would be no escaping what they had done. If you condemn killing of innocent Gabby or any form of child abuse, subscribe to this channel. Gabrielle was gone. Her small body lay still on the cold examination table as the medical examiner prepared to uncover the full extent of what she had endured. What they found in that autopsy room would confirm what investigators already suspected: this was no single act of violence. This was long-term, calculated cruelty. The injuries on her body told a story of unending suffering. Gabby's burns were not fresh, some had started to heal, only for new ones to be added. Her arms, legs, and back bore scars on top of scars, as if her body had been treated as something disposable. Some of the burns had penetrated so deeply that her skin had peeled away, exposing raw, unprotected flesh. And then, there were the bruises. Layers of them. Old ones, new ones, some already faded, others still a violent shade of purple. This wasn't a single outburst of anger. This was methodical punishment, inflicted over and over, until her body couldn't take it anymore. But the abuse went beyond physical wounds. Gabby's teeth were rotting, some cracked and broken, a clear sign of severe neglect. She was malnourished, her body lacking the nutrients a growing child so desperately needed. She had lost weight. Her arms and legs, once full of childhood softness, were thin, frail, weak. She had spent months, maybe years, being deprived of food, of care, of even the most basic necessities. And then there was the final cause of death. Gabby hadn't just died from the burns. She hadn't just succumbed to the pain. The medical examiner confirmed what made this case even more disturbing: Gabby had been suffocated. That meant she had fought until the very end. As her tiny body struggled to recover from one final night of unimaginable suffering, as the pain raged through her burned skin, as her body weakened from lack of food, as her organs began to fail, someone took away her last breath. Someone chose to end it, chose to press down, to hold her there, to make sure she never got back up. Her own mother. Or the man her mother had chosen over her. Maybe both. Investigators already knew the abuse hadn't been hidden, it had been talked about. And when they went through Candace Diaz and Brad Field's phones, what they found was undeniable proof of what had been happening inside that trailer. There were messages between Candace and Brad, discussing punishments, treating Gabby as an inconvenience, a problem to be solved. They didn't see her as a child, they saw her as a burden. One message described what would happen if Gabby wet herself again. Another mocked her suffering, as if it was some kind of joke, something to laugh about, something to share in private conversations. There were no messages of regret. No messages where Candace worried that things had gone too far. No moments where Brad hesitated. They were fully aware of what they were doing, and they didn't care. And then there was the most chilling part. Gabby hadn't just been abused physically. She had been treated as less than human. She hadn't been given a warm bed to sleep in. No soft pillow, no blanket. Instead, she had been forced to sleep on a plastic garbage bag, a clear message from the people who were supposed to love her. You don't deserve comfort. You don't deserve warmth. You don't deserve care. When the winter months rolled in, when the Michigan cold crept into the trailer, Gabby was left to shiver through the night. She had no extra layers to keep her warm, no heated room to protect her from the freezing air. She was left exposed, suffering in the same space where she had endured so much pain. And yet, no one outside that home stepped in. No one made a call. No one saved her. As investigators pieced together the horrific reality of Gabby's short life, as they read through the messages, as they looked at the evidence in front of them, one question remained. How could anyone do this? And just as disturbing, how had they managed to get away with it for so long? The answers would come soon. Because Candace Diaz and Brad Fields were about to be found. And when they were, there would be no running from what they had done. By the time the details of Gabby Barrett's death were made public, the horror of what had happened inside that trailer had sent shockwaves across the country. News headlines carried the unspeakable truth: a 4-year-old girl, tortured, burned, and suffocated by the very people who were supposed to protect her. The photographs from inside the home, the forensic reports, the damning text messages, it was undeniable. This wasn't a case of neglect. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. And the two people responsible were nowhere to be found. When first responders arrived on New Year's Day and realized the extent of Gabby's injuries, they knew this case wasn't just another tragedy, it was something far more horrific. Something no one could ignore. Law enforcement wasted no time in issuing arrest warrants for Candace Diaz and Brad Fields, formally charging them with murder, felony child abuse, and torture. But there was one problem. They were already gone. By the time authorities arrived to take them into custody, they had vanished. The filthy trailer where Gabby had suffered for months was empty, abandoned. The air inside was still thick with the stench of rot, the floors still caked in filth. But the people responsible for it all had slipped away, running before they could face what they had done. For 6 days, Candace Diaz and Brad Fields were fugitives. 6 days, law enforcement agencies across the country were on high alert. The U.S. Marshals, the FBI, local police, everyone was watching. Their names and photographs were broadcast on national television. Wanted posters were plastered across news sites. Social media exploded with outrage, with people across the country demanding justice for the little girl who never had a chance. And then, nearly 800 miles away, a tip came in. A car matching the description of the one Diaz and Fields had fled and was spotted in Lake Park, Georgia, a small town near the Florida border. They weren't hiding in some elaborate hideout. They were living out of their vehicle. When law enforcement descended on the scene, there was no dramatic chase, no final act of defiance. Candace and Brad were found inside the car, exhausted, disheveled, their attempts to disappear already falling apart. They had tried to outrun justice, but in the end, they were just two fugitives with nowhere left to go. They were taken into custody without a fight. No remorse. No grief. Just two people who had done the unthinkable and were now facing the consequences. When Candace Diaz and Brad Fields were extradited back to Michigan, they walked into the courtroom as accused murderers. And for the first time, they had to face the people whose lives they had shattered. Gabby's family sat in the courtroom, their faces etched with grief, with rage, with the unbearable weight of knowing that this child, this innocent, defenseless little girl, had suffered in ways they could hardly fathom. Her father, Kyle Barrett, had barely been able to see his daughter in the months before her death. Diaz and Fields had kept her away, always claiming she was sick, always making excuses. Now he knew the truth. Now he knew why. Gabby's grandfather, Jerry Barrett, sat still, his hands clenched. He had suspected something was wrong. He had wanted to see her. But he had been shut out. And now, the people who had kept her from him were sitting just feet away, shackled, silent, exposed. Then came the evidence. Prosecutors didn't need to rely on speculation. They had proof. One by one, the photographs were shown to the jury. Images of Gabby's body, covered in burns and bruises. The medical examiner took the stand and described what he had seen when he examined her. The burns so severe that her skin had melted into the bathtub drain. The missing toe. The bruises layered over one another. The unmistakable signs of long-term starvation. Then came the text messages. Jurors sat in silence as they listened to messages sent between Candace Diaz and Brad Fields, messages where they openly discussed punishing Gabby, where they talked about how they would teach her a lesson for wetting the bed. There was no way to argue against it. These messages were not mistakes. They were proof of intent. Proof of cruelty. Proof of two people who had no regard for the life of a child. And then, the most powerful testimonies of all. Gabby's family spoke. Her father. Her grandfather. The people who had loved her, who had wanted to protect her but never got the chance. Her father's voice broke as he spoke about the last time he had seen her alive. How he never got to hold her one last time. How he had trusted that she was being cared for, only to find out that she had been living in a nightmare. And then, the first responders. Hardened paramedics, experienced officers, people who had seen death, tragedy, and suffering throughout their careers, but none of them had ever seen anything like this. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. They didn't need embellishment. The facts spoke for themselves. And the verdict? It was never in doubt. But what would their sentences be? That was the question that still remained. And when it was finally answered, it would leave the entire courtroom divided. The courtroom sat in silence as the judge prepared to deliver the final sentences. The weight of what had been revealed in that trial, the unbearable cruelty that had come to light, had left even the most experienced legal professionals shaken. There was no redemption here. No justification. No excuse. Only a child whose life had been stolen in the most brutal way imaginable, and the two people who had made sure she never had a future. The judge's voice was steady, his words cutting through the still air with finality. Brad Fields, you have been found guilty of felony murder, first-degree child abuse, and torture. Your sentence is life in prison without the possibility of parole. Fields sat motionless, his expression unreadable. But there was no shock. No protest. No display of remorse. Just the cold, hollow acknowledgement that this was always how it was going to end. He had stolen a life, and now, his own life would be spent behind bars, with no hope of release. Then, the judge turned to Candice Diaz. Candice Diaz, you have pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, first-degree child abuse, and manslaughter. Your sentence is a minimum of 30 years to a maximum of 60 years in prison. For the first time since the trial began, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. A reaction that couldn't be contained. People had expected justice, but was this it? 30 years. 30 years for a mother who had stood by, who had allowed, no, who had participated in, the suffering of her own child. Kyle Barrett, Gabby's father, clenched his jaw. His hands were shaking as he sat there, listening to the woman who had brought his daughter into this world being given a sentence that, compared to the weight of what she had done, felt insultingly light. Gabby's grandfather, Jerry Barrett, could barely hold back his anger. He had waited to see Diaz face the consequences she deserved. But 30 years? That meant that one day, she could walk free. She could start over. She could have a future. Gabby never got that chance. Now, we ask you, do you think justice was served? If yes, subscribe to this channel, if no, then why? Outside the courthouse, the community's reaction was immediate. People gathered, some holding signs, some just standing there in disbelief. She should never get out. How is 30 years enough? That little girl suffered for months, maybe years, and she gets to have a life when Gabby never did? There was outrage. There was heartbreak. There was a feeling that, even though justice had been served, it hadn't been enough. But there was something else, too. A question that no one could ignore. How did it get this far? How had Gabby been allowed to suffer for so long without anyone stepping in? How had so many missed the warning signs? How had no one, not a neighbor, not a doctor, not a single person, saved her before it was too late? In the aftermath of Gabby's death, Child Protective Services came under scrutiny. People wanted to know, had there been reports? Had anyone ever tried to get her help? And if so, why had nothing been done? In the wake of her case, there were calls for reform. For stricter oversight. For more intervention. For a system that wouldn't just acknowledge the warning signs, but act on them before another child ended up like Gabby. But for Gabby's family, for those who loved her, it was too late. There would be no second chances. No appeals. No way to undo the pain she had endured. Gabrielle Barrett should have grown up. She should have had birthdays filled with cake and laughter. She should have had a first day of kindergarten. She should have had snowball fights in the winter, bike rides in the summer, bedtime stories, and warm embraces and a future that was never taken from her. But she never got those things. Instead, her name became a reminder. A reminder of a child who suffered in silence. A reminder of what happens when cruelty is ignored. A reminder of how easily the most innocent among us can slip through the cracks. And so the world moved forward. Candice Diaz was locked away. Brad Fields would never again see the outside of a prison cell. The courtroom emptied, the headlines shifted, people returned to their lives. But for those who had sat in that courtroom, who had seen the pictures, who had heard the testimony, who had witnessed the unthinkable unfold before them, Gabby's story would never be forgotten. And the question that lingered in the air long after the trial was over remained the same. How many other children were still out there, waiting for someone to save them? Gabrielle Barrett's story is one that should have never ended the way it did. She should have had a life. She should have been outside playing in the grass, laughing without fear, waking up in a home filled with warmth, not shivering on a plastic garbage bag. She should have had birthdays with balloons and candles, not a cold, unmarked grave where people now leave flowers. She was only 4 years old. A child still learning how the world worked, still trusting that those around her would protect her. She had no voice in that house. No power. No way out. And when she needed saving, no one came. But the hardest truth to face is this: Gabby's story is not the only one. There are children right now living through their own silent nightmares. Some of them are being starved, beaten, and locked away from the world. Some of them are crying themselves to sleep at night, hoping that someone, anyone, will notice. Some of them will survive. Some won't. And that should make every single one of us stop and ask, what are we doing to stop this? How many signs do we ignore? How often do we turn the other way when we see a child who looks afraid, who flinches when a parent raises their voice, who never seems to have enough food or clean clothes? How many times have we hesitated to speak up because we didn't want to get involved? Gabby didn't get a second chance. But someone else might. If you ever suspect a child is in danger, say something. Call. Report it. Because one phone call could be the difference between life and death. If you believe that no child should ever suffer like Gabby did, let us know in the comments. What do you think should change? What can society do to stop cases like this from happening again? Let's make sure her name is not forgotten. Let's make sure no child suffers in silence. And if you want to hear more stories that must be told, stories of justice, of tragedy, of the hidden truths that demand to be uncovered, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. Because these stories need to be heard. If you thought this case was horrific, there's another story, one so disturbing that even investigators had trouble believing it was real. A case of a child who vanished from the very people meant to protect her. Nobody. No confession. No easy answers. And yet, the truth is out there. Stay with us. Because this is only the beginning.